Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. I'm your host, Hena Zuberi. Today, I am going to be discussing Israel, Palestine, and U.S. domestic policies. Now, it's Isra wal Mi'raj night tonight for many of us around the world, depending on where you follow the moon. And this is the night where we celebrate the accession of the Prophet Muhammad from Masjid al-Aqsa. Friends of Masjid al-Aqsa are producing programs throughout this week on the benefits and the virtues of the mosque. Within this context, also, I would also like to share that American Muslims for Palestine have been doing an excellent job in highlighting, and they're hosting a global dua tonight, prayers from, because a lot of us are not allowed to enter Masjid al-Aqsa and worship there. In other news, the boycott divestment campaign has urged a boycott of HP companies because they support Israel army and the police. And specifically because of the population database that the Israeli army uses to enforce racial segregation. Hashtag boycott HP has been showing up on our Twitter feeds. The BDS campaign says that the HP branded corporations play key roles in Israel's oppression of Palestine. They're complicit in Israel's occupation and the apartheid regime. They provide specifically computer hardware to the Israeli army and maintain data centers through their servers for the Israeli police. They provide the titanium servers that operate AVIV systems, AVIV, the computerized database of Israel's population and immigration authority. This forms the backbone of Israel's racial segregation and apartheid. So this was some news from that region, but today we have a guest with us, Abby Martin. Abby is a journalist, a documentary filmmaker, and a political commentator. She's a former host of Breaking the Set and is the director of Gaza Fights for Freedom, the creator of Empire Files, an interview and documentary series. And she's worked in relation with Council on American Relations and the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. So we're welcoming Abby here today and celebrating her work against racism, injustice, and violation of international law. Thank you so much. Welcome, Abby.
Thank you so much for having me, Hannah.
So, Abby, we want to learn a little bit more about, so we understand that you run the Empire Files, but can you tell us a little bit more about your work in regards to Palestine?
Sure, absolutely. I think when you are involved in anti-war work and also anti-imperialism, when you're looking at the world through the lens of anti-imperialism and U.S. foreign policy and U.S. empire, which is what we do with the Empire Files, we feel like every foreign policy and domestic issue needs to be seen through the lens of the U.S. as the largest global military machine that the world has ever seen, and how that impacts the populations around the world, how that impacts here at home, the people here at home. It's kind of part and parcel with Palestinian liberation, because Israel, as you mentioned, is an apartheid state that is completely, wholly subsidized by the U.S. military industrial complex. This is a government that gets billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars every year. Just in the last COVID relief package, we saw tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, going to subsidize Israeli apartheid. Israel kind of being untouched by the international community, and we can talk about the ICC decision and how that may impact justice for Palestinians finally. But the impunity and the unaccountability for Israel has only been because of the U.S. empire's staunch support for this regime. So I think just through my life, I mean, through being involved in this kind of work, you have to understand the situation and you have to care about it because, 15 years ago, I think it was very controversial. People said that the Palestine liberation movement or Free Palestine banners being mixed in with the Iraq war, oh, that's too divisive, this is mixed messaging. I think now, 15 years later, the Overton window has been moved and the consciousness has shifted to such an extreme degree that people know now you are simply not welcome in progressive spaces or anti-war spaces unless you believe in the liberation of Palestine. And so that really shows you how much the movement has shifted consciousness, which is a great thing. And I think that's why the Israeli government is so terrified of the BDS movement, which we can also get into. So that's a little bit more about how I became involved in the issue. And of course, just over the course of my work for the last 10, 15 years, I've constantly covered this. And as you mentioned, ended up directing a film, Gaza Fights for Freedom, about the Great March of Return in 2019. And now I am actually engaged in litigation against Georgia, the state of Georgia, for their anti-BDS law.
So we're going to talk about your case, but first, let me just for many of us in the audience who may not know about anti-BDS law, so to begin simply, what is the anti-BDS law and how does it violate constitutional rights in the United States?
It's a great question, because I think that if you were to pull the average American on the street and tell them there are actual laws on the books in more than half the states in the US that actually mandate a loyalty oath to a foreign country, they would be completely appalled. But that is in fact what we've seen happen. It's taken place completely under the radar in nearly 30 states so far. This is what it seems to be. I mean, it's a loyalty oath mandating people to sign away their constitutional liberties in order to not boycott Israel in order to work in a certain state. So let me explain my case, because it fits clearly into the laws. I was supposed to give a keynote address at a media conference at Georgia Southern University in February of last year, in 2020. I was given a contract because I was supposed to make $1,000 honorarium giving this keynote address. I was given a contract as an independent contractor in the state that said, you cannot boycott the state of Israel if you want to make money in the state of Georgia. As someone who's been covering these laws and just covering, of course, Israeli apartheid for so long, I was absolutely shocked that I was given such a contract. But I've heard of these laws impacting people before, Hena. I mean, this doesn't matter if you are a lecturer like myself, or if you are a speech pathologist in Texas, like we know one Palestinian woman was given such a contract, if you're a construction worker, really, if you are simply working in any of these 30 or so states, you have to forfeit your constitutional right to free speech and your constitutional right to participate in political boycotts, which is a Supreme Court protected part of the First Amendment back to the Civil Rights era. You have to forfeit those constitutional rights in order to work in these states. Of course, in good conscience, I could not do that. I mean, that would actually mean that I would have to go back and, throw away my entire body of work if I wanted to make money in Georgia doing this. It is an absolute assault on the First Amendment, and it is such a flagrant violation of our civil liberties that it's just beyond the pale that any judge, that any legislature on a local level has passed these laws and not really given them a second thought. And now we're at a situation where people are having to challenge these laws on a local and state level. In several cases, the judges have deemed them unconstitutional and thrown them out. We just saw that in Arkansas just a couple weeks ago. So what Georgia is doing now is trying to render my case moot so they can please Israel and keep the laws on the book, by simply raising, the price that would trigger this contract to $100,000 now instead of $1,000. So that's where we're at today. But we see these laws across the books in dozens of states, and they are very, very worrisome, because I think it shows you the extraordinary influence that Israel has, and the staunch partnership, this undying alliance that just completely can undermine American liberties and constitutional rights to please and benefit a foreign nation. And
so this is something that a lot of people do not understand, that they believe that this is a foreign policy issue, right? So how does it start affecting at the state level? And now, for example, in your case in Georgia, do you think the election of these two new senators would make any difference in Georgia, or it'll be more of the same?
I mean, it's a good question, because I think if you were to explain to people again, like there's a foreign government that you have to sign allegiance to in order to work in these states. If you were to replace Israel with any other country, like let's just say Russia as a thought experiment, can you imagine the brain melt that would happen across the political spectrum of having to actually forfeit our liberties in order to sign an oath to Russia or China or any of these so-called enemy states that are deemed such a threat to this country? But for some reason, Israel just seems like an extension, like an appendage of the US, and that's what we're kind of brainwashed and conditioned to believe. So I think that people don't really give it a second thought. It is very shocking, but it just kind of goes by the wayside. And I think that when it's posed as combating, really cynically so, if I may say, combating anti-Semitism, and that's what the BDS fight has been centered around today, to, of course, undermine it, right? And charge the outrageous accusation that you're anti-Semitic if you simply want to end an apartheid regime and have rights for all Palestinians. So that's the way that the debate has been framed, and that's the way that these laws have been passed. Now, you ask if the recent election, where the two new Democratic senators in Georgia have been elected, if that will change the outcome. I fear not, because when you look at the Democratic establishment writ large, it is pretty much indistinguishable from the Republican establishment when it comes to the alliance and allegiance for the state of Israel. There are very, very few Congress people that have actually come out. I mean, Ilhan Omar, of course, is one. Rashida Tlaib, of course, being a Palestinian, and they have been completely overly criticized, smeared, slandered. I mean, it's just unbelievable when they just come out courageously to talk accurately about the situation and say, BDS is a constitutional right. People should have the right to boycott apartheid if they want, but also Palestinians deserve equal rights. I mean, we just saw what happened with the Saturday Night Live joke. This was an accurate assessment on medical apartheid in Israel, and there was campaigns, not only across the corporate media to censor Saturday Night Live, but actually campaigns, protests led by the Israeli lobby to demand an apology and a retraction for an accurate statement. So when you're looking at the political sphere, I mean, this is a third rail issue. I think many of my journalistic colleagues would agree that this is a third rail issue, but when it comes to politics and politicians, it's even worse. You're not going to find that much of a difference between Democrats and Republicans. And you can just look at the Biden administration, who, Biden has said he's an unapologetic Zionist. And if Israel didn't exist in the Middle East, the US would have to create one to serve its own interests.
Exactly. This is more of the same. Now we do have some students who've been really concerned with this law and how it impacts their freedom of speech on campuses. So on one hand, you have the Campus Free Speech Act, and then the anti-BDS law, and the combination of this. How does this affect and control people's expressions and beliefs? So what is the impact on students of this law?
This is where the threat lies the most with the US government and the Israeli government, because they know that pro-Palestine activism and organizing on campus, the divestment movement being spearheaded across college campuses, has been tremendously successful. And that is really kind of the root and origin of where the BDS movement has taken off in a lot of instances. And so you saw an executive order by Trump to suppress that, again, to conflate it with anti-Semitism, to kind of this overarching threat of student bodies, to say that you will essentially not be able to work later on if you are associated with BDS activism on the college campus level. You mentioned the Campus Free Speech Act. This is an interesting act that really shows you the contradictory measures that are in place on the state level in states like Georgia. So on one hand, you have conservatives bemoaning about cancel culture and their right to have free speech on campus. So we're talking about extreme right-wing ideologies or beliefs like, adjacent to Nazism or fascism. And those people want to have the right to speak on college campuses. Now, as someone who believes in the First Amendment, sure, all rights should be protected. All free speech should be protected. However, there has been laws passed, like the Campus Free Speech Act, that protects this kind of speech. Yet at the same time, you will have this anti-BDS law on the books that at the same time undermines and targets pro-Palestine activism and speech, not only on the campus level, but of course the state-wide level. So this top-down hierarchical control and suppression of the most dangerous types of speech to the establishment, which of course is pro-Palestine speech and criticism of Israel. It's quite telling when you look at those laws side by side. But I will say that absolutely there has been a concerted effort to crack down on the campus level, institutionally across the country, because that is where they fear the most energy is swelling for the boycott, divestment, sanctions effort worldwide.
So, and keeping that in mind, there's a former law school student at UCLA. She interviewed with a small feminist magazine. And then following up with that, her personal information, dossiers were published online. She was doxxed and labeled an anti-Semite and a supporter of terrorism. So you've been doing this work for 10 years. Can you share with us what sort of, I mean, there has to be harassment. All of us go through this. So what sort of, what have you faced personally?
Yes, as a white ally with a certain amount of privilege as an American citizen, it is my duty and obligation, of course, to talk about this. And I find it shameful that so many of my colleagues are silent on it. But of course, I mean, it opens you up to a number of attacks. I remember when I first was talking about this on Russia Today, I talked about the eugenics program that the Israeli government was employing against Ethiopian Jewish citizens, injecting them with Depo-Provera birth control against their knowledge. And this is this eugenics technique, right? Of course, talking about that just opens you up to a slew of attacks. Okay, you're associating this with Nazism, and therefore you're anti-Semitic. If you dare to compare the concentration camp in Gaza with the Jewish internment camps, you are, how dare you, you're anti-Semitic. So saying things that can be construed as comparisons to Nazism or the genocide of Jews in World War II opens you up to so much. And that's what happened to me, just simply discussing these things. The Israeli lobby, you had Al Jaminer, I think the publication was, ridiculous article after article that permanently stays with you, right? It's now just permanently on your Wikipedia page. It's the first thing that people see if they're Googling you, and it discredits you because people don't understand the context of these remarks, and they don't understand your body of work, and they just take these publications at face value. I've also gotten, direct threats essentially from the Israeli government covering Operation Pillar of Cloud when the Israeli government bombed the Al-Sharouk journalist tower in Gaza. And they said that RT had taken a side in the coverage, and that's why they did what they did. Now, I was the one out there every day lambasting Israeli war crimes that were taking place. And so to me, that was a direct admission that they bombed this journalist tower because of my coverage. Now, fast forward when I was actually in the West Bank in 2017, and I tried to fill out the proper press credentials working for Telesur, which was a highly acclaimed Latin American network that spans multiple countries in Latin America. And they banned me for life from getting into Gaza because they said I was not only a propagandist, but an enemy agent of Iran, which is a really serious allegation and a very scary one at that when you are in the borders of 48 to be called that by the Israeli government. Fast forward to now going on Joe Rogan's show, the most popular podcast in the world, using my platform to talk about all of my experiences in the occupied West Bank, then having subsequently Stand With Us, which is another extension and appendage of the Israeli government, come out, put a huge pressure campaign on Joe Rogan to have an Israeli government official come on to basically denounce everything that I said. And they sent him hundreds of form letters trying to have him basically throw me under the bus. Luckily, he didn't do that. But it really just shows you the enormous effort that they will go through when someone like me or someone who is speaking the truth about this issue is able to get it out on a wide on a wide platform, and because they are used to controlling the narrative, and now with the advent of social media, they can't do that much anymore.
So, what advice would you give someone like Kaval Singh, who went through this as well, and other women of color who stand up for Palestine, perhaps who are not Palestinian themselves, but they do perhaps they're in that crosshairs and face extensive online harassment?
I mean, it's hard to extend my advice to a woman of color because I can't ever be put in their shoes of what they go through with this extreme bigotry and harassment in the culture that we're living in today with, post 9/11 world. But I will say that, again, I think the mass consciousness has completely shifted. You look at public opinion polls in this country, and the numbers are astronomical through the roof of people who, if you just look at the facts and you posit, you present to them what the actual situation is, I think that the vast majority of people would agree that one vote and equal rights for all in Palestine. And I think that the truth is on our side. And it's just the big lie that's been perpetrated that keeps the fear maintained and keeps people from speaking up about this issue. But I think that once you see, you can't unsee. And so many people, tens of millions of people in this country get it. And that's why we saw someone like Bernie Sanders, who was the front runner, in the Democratic primary for quite a while and has that massive youth movement behind him. He was speaking about Palestinian rights and Palestinian liberation in ways that we have never heard a politician speak before. And he was a Jewish man. And that shows you the advancement. I mean, just 4 years prior, he was barely uttering condemnation of Israel during the 2014 massacre. And that shows you the movement, the push, the pressure of the movement that has pushed these politicians to address this in the anti-war community, in the progressive spaces. So the youth has the truth on their side and has the momentum on their side. And so we need to be comforted with the fact that there are tens of millions of people that have our back and that see the lie. And even though the political establishment may be unchanged largely, the truth has permeated through the social media sphere and through mass consciousness. And we have to keep pushing forward with that. We have to keep going.
That brings me to a question about establishment Democrats. I can understand Republicans, many of them who are evangelical Christians, whose religious beliefs form their views about Israel. They believe in the coming, and they believe that Israel needs to be. That's their religious belief. Why do established Democrats why is that stance with them? I've never completely understood that.
Well, first of all, we have to look at the fact that 99% of establishment Democrats who are actually in politics are imperialist and capitalist. So these are reigning orthodoxies that you have to adhere to in order to be accepted in the political establishment in the first place, right? In order to win these races, in order to get the corporate donors, in order to be present as a part of the U.S. empire's apparatus, right? And so in order to get to where they are, and you could say the same with corporate media journalists, there's the issue of self-censorship, where you do care about progressive issues, you know what you can and can't talk about at these news outlets. I think by and large, not only the political establishment, namely establishment Democrats, but also corporate news journalists know that you need to believe in these things. You would not get hired, you would not get where you are unless you completely believed in American exceptionalism, unless you believed that America is the greatest country that's ever lived. And whenever we do these military endeavors around the world, these foreign interventions, it's in the name of humanitarianism to spread human rights and democracy. I mean, you actually have to believe that, right? Otherwise, you couldn't do your job. And I think that just goes along with the mythos, this idea, this notion that Israel is the greatest ally that the U.S. has ever had, that Israel is, they don't really want to talk about what Israel really is. I think the naked imperialists will admit that Israel is a battering ram for U.S. imperialism and U.S. militarism in the Middle East. And that's why it's so important. It's not only this gas station for the U.S. military, but it also is used as a military arm, right, to kind of keep watch on the surrounding Arab nations. But this myth that's permeated that Israel is the greatest democracy, and it's surrounded by all these people who hate it, and it needs the US to support it militarily, economically, politically in order to survive. It's just such an egregious lie. I mean, really, everything that we're told about Israel is really, the opposite is really true. It's not the most complicated issue in the world. These people haven't been fighting over there for millennia. It's actually a very simple notion of colonizer and colonized, oppressor and oppressed. It's building a country on top of indigenous people that are still being ethnically cleansed 70 years later. So, it's shameful, again, that this issue has been so diluted and screwed and continues to be so, because it really is clear as day when you just look beyond the headlines.
That leads me to a question that I wanted to ask about, and if you've noticed this. We've seen this, so I wanted to know if it's come on your radar as well. There's a rise of fascism in places like India. India and Israel have been buying weapons, trade deals with each other, recognition. I mean, across the Gulf states, we've seen that recognition as well. But especially, I wanted to specifically talk about India. The rise of Hindu nationalism in that country and their ties with Israel. We're seeing reflections of that here, with ties of Zionists, with Hindutva ideologues here in the United States. Have you seen anything of that? And I would love to get your commentary on that.
I can't speak too much about India, but I will say that people are mistaken if they think that Israel depends on the US military to buy weapons. Israel is a huge arms dealer in its own right. And you're absolutely right that they are forming sordid partnerships with countries like India to sell massive amounts of armaments. And they have weapons expos where they actually, a selling point of some of these weapons is battle tested, right? Battle tested, meaning they're used on the caged population of Gaza. And it's very disturbing, actually. But yeah, I mean, there's long-standing ties with fascist movements and neo-Nazi movements around the world that Israel seems to not be perturbed or disturbed by. So it is very interesting when the actual, very real growing threat of anti-Semitism is creeping and adjacent to kind of white nationalist movements in the US. And it seems like the US political establishment and the Israeli government aren't that concerned about that. They just want to crack down on pro-Palestine speech and conflate it dangerously with anti-Semitism. You have to really ask yourself, what is going on here?
This is yes, this is absolutely what you're saying, is this focus on pro-Palestine speech without regard to anything else, especially the rise of fascism. Even in this country, the past 4 years, what we saw take place, not that much has changed. Kids are still in cages, people are still being deported, but that that having a center stage from the White House of fascism in this country. I wanted to share more about the Empire Files with our audience. So, can you tell me about the show? What is the Empire Files, and what's the motivation behind your series?
Sure. Well, it's really looking at every single issue around the world through the lens of how the US is the largest, most destructive force that the world has ever seen in terms of militarism, imperialism, and the subjugation of tens of millions who are living under the boot of US hegemony around the world. And that can mean the legacy of dirty wars, in Latin America, the legacy of anti-communism that has destroyed and subverted the sovereignty and self-determination of dozens of countries around the world through the Cold War. Or you can look now through the lens of the war on terror and this kind of normalization of drone bombings and special forces, special operations that are essentially killing Black people and people of color around the world every single day. And this has become such a normalized thing in the background of Americans that it is just so disturbing to me that we just don't even take a second thought about what our government is doing in our name around the world on a daily basis. And you can link it all to domestic policy. Why are we such a failed state? Why are there 500,000 deaths from COVID? Why is it that we are the only advanced industrialized nation in the world that commodifies everything, including healthcare, housing, school? All of these things go along with the fact that all of our money and resources are being siphoned into a giant military industrial complex, an apparatus that is out of control, that Martin Luther King warned us about decades ago. He said that a nation that basically squanders all of its money into the military is going to face a spiritual death. And that warning was not heeded. And here we are 70 years later, and it is just an absolute failed state. I mean, the fact that Jackson, Mississippi is without running water, the fact that Flint still doesn't have safe water for its children. And here we are spending trillions of dollars on the war on terror, spending trillions of dollars to blow people up and kill people on a daily basis with tens of thousands of military munitions, while leaving our people to rot in the streets at home. The homelessness epidemic, the opiate crisis, all of these issues really, and the mass shooting epidemic. I mean, where you really look at, America is exceptional, but in all of the worst ways, which really embody the failed state that we're dealing with today. And it directly links to the way our military is engaging itself around the world. It asserts itself as the moral arbiter. It has the imperial hubris to say, no, here are the enemy countries, here are our friends and foes. And it doesn't matter if you're an egregious human rights offender or violator. If you bow down to US imperialism and US capitalism, you're our friend. But if you have some semblance of independence, you're on the chopping block. And that's what we've seen happen over and over and over again. And now we see it with Iran, we see it with Venezuela. We're now, Biden is now posturing to isolate China and Russia, two nuclear armed states. It's a very dangerous world with the US as the empire. And unfortunately, Americans are so grossly ignorant of this obvious fact that it's going to take a massive political education movement and awakening to link this together with all of the struggles that we face today. Even kids in cages at the border. Israel, Israeli technology is funding a lot of these border problems. Police are trained by the Israeli military, all of our police forces around the world. So you can link Black Lives Matter to, our support for the Israeli apartheid regime. Really, every issue you can link to it.
What would you say to those who say, we need this? We need the greatest military in the world. I mean, the military is glorified in our movies. It's glorified in, they come into the schools to recruit directly from high school. And so there's a large military culture in the United States, number one. Number two, and a lot of people absolutely believe that we need this gigantic military to protect us. What do you say to them?
I would say that there hasn't been an actual threat facing the United States for as long as I can remember. And you cannot look at 9/11 in a vacuum. There's many questions that I have about that event, about the warnings that were not heeded about. You can look at the funding of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban back in the US intervention in Afghanistan. I mean, all of these things cannot be looked at in a vacuum of why there's certain blowback that happens here. Of course, the military culture is so strong here because they need it to be. They need to associate militarism with patriotism in order for this whole system to work, right? And if you question that, well, you're un-American. Well, you should just leave, love it or leave it. It's just these childish, notions that are just so ignorant. But I would say, this has all been kind of seeded together because you can look at Hollywood and sports even. It's so ingrained and deep rooted in our psychology as Americans and our culture. And that is a purposeful display because you need to, again, associate patriotism with the fact that we have this massive out of control military and that we are the world's dominant empire. If you go to the argument of, okay, well, we need to be the empire because if we're not, then another country would take our place, which would be worse, right? And that again is just disgusting levels of hubris and arrogance, and to say that, oh, China would commit. We're committing egregious atrocities around the world, killing people, maiming people, causing tens of millions of refugees. So I'm sorry, but I'm not going to go into some great thought experiment about, oh, if the US wasn't in this role, then another country would take over and be worse. That is an absurd notion. What happened to international cooperation and dealing with crises like climate change, which also, by the way, the US military is the world's largest polluter and causer of climate change. But no, we absolutely do not need a military that's stronger and bigger than the next 12 countries combined. I mean, it's ludicrous to think that this is necessary. It's ludicrous to think that that having multi-trillion-dollar military is necessary for anything. It's just that it needs to assert itself as this out-of-control machine that no one will dare to threaten or try to undermine, because they will be completely obliterated and destroyed. And we have proven that through our actions, our criminal actions in Iraq and elsewhere in the last 20 years.
You tweeted on January 10th, 2020, the success of BDS has terrified the political establishment, who pursued an aggressive bipartisan push to ban Israelis' boycott across the United States. Trump's recent executive order further cements this goal. Can this still be said with the change of administration in the White House?
Yes, I think it can be, because even with Trump in office, the Free Palestine movement and the BDS movement can win. And that's what's so important to understand. It doesn't matter who is in the White House. It's grassroots struggle in the streets, linking up with different organizations and creating the masses that will force the hand of government. And it doesn't matter what your issue is, but that's the way issues have always been won. And the BDS movement is no different than that. We've seen an international coalition join together. The US is kind of the latest to the game in trying to hold Israel accountable for this, but BDS has been, a huge issue all around the world. We've seen sports teams, we've seen entire companies divest from Israel, college campuses, universities around the world, actual members of parliament, right? But so America is kind of late to the game, which is sad, because again, it all stems from this government, its support for Israel, and we need to really pressure the US government and our politicians in order to stop this alliance. But absolutely, Biden being in office, it doesn't matter. Trump, Biden, whoever it is, it's going to come from the masses. It's going to come from a movement that is millions strong, that is finally saying no more. We cannot sit idly by while millions of people are deprived of water, of basic nutrition, of medical equipment. We're in a global pandemic right now. There is a brutal military occupation that's depriving people of basic fundamental rights. And there are millions of people caged in a warehouse that even the UN said in 2020 was going to be unlivable. So it's 2021 now. Where are we? So this grave humanitarian crisis falls on the shoulders of American citizens, and it's due time that we wake up and figure out how we can join local solidarity organizations and really pressure this government to say no more. Because Trump's allegiance with Netanyahu, I think, exposed the fascistic nature of Israel. You know, Joe Biden can only apologize so much, and the Democrats can only say so much. Okay, they have criticism for the right wing in Israel, but it's still a democratic state, and it's still a greatest ally. Well, I think Trump, being an open white nationalist, having a base of fascists in the US, and being the strongest ally to Israel that Israel has ever seen, I really think exposed that fraudulent notion that Israel is a democracy and progressive and all the rest. No, I think Trump really exposed that. And so Democrats are kind of running scared, figuring out how can they pick up the pieces from where Trump left off. And they couldn't figure out how to apologize or excuse away that partnership. And I think that when Trump left office, we saw the acceleration of the annexation of the West Bank. Tons of settlements were approved, because I think Netanyahu and the right wing in Israel know that under Biden, it's not going to be as easy. And Biden does have to give, he does have to give credence to the progressive movement to a certain extent. And I think that they can't just give carte blanche to Israel anymore without knowing there's going to be extreme backlash from the progressive base that Biden needs to get reelected.
Mm. With this, we are seeing for the first time in the past last Congress, and I think it's going to come up, the act is going to come up again, the resolution. We are actually seeing pro-Palestine legislation being introduced in Congress for perhaps the first time. Yes, definitely the first time. What do you say about this? And is there any hopes of it actually getting passed? In this
what is the bill again, please tell me.
The bill, the one of the bills is for not using American aid to cage children, Palestinian children. And perhaps one of the producers could pull that act up, the resolution up for us. And so this is something that we've seen. We've recently we actually had a Palestinian activist come in and talk about this in a couple of shows ago. And this is something that this said to me was how much the tone has changed. There's no way that you could walk in the time from when the Holy Land Foundation leaders were caged and some of them are still political prisoners, to now when there's actually pro-Palestinian resolutions being introduced into Congress.
Yes, I do know what bill you're talking about now. And you would think that Democrats who have this outrage against kids in cages here would care about kids in cages everywhere. But again, we're talking about, extending your empathy beyond the nation state and the borders of this country. So it's hard for people to do when you're living, as an empire baby. But I do think that the proposal of such legislation, as well as, again, like the fact that Bernie Sanders was talking about withdrawing illegal settlements to the 1967 borders, things like this, those are huge measures. Those are huge statements. And again, that's a testament to the movement. That's a testament to how much people have pushed politicians already that have forced them to address these things. You can look at the DNC, the people who were going as part of the DNC delegation in the 2016 election, they were actually holding up signs in the arena saying "Free Palestine." That was completely unheard of just years prior to that. So I think that every time Israel advances, more settlements, more annexation of the West Bank, every single time that they go on, they have another bloodletting in Gaza and just indiscriminately bomb people, the American public, as well as the international public, are seeing these images. A lot of people for the first time, right? Because the corporate media can no longer dictate what the truth and reality of the situation is. We see it for the first time. Palestinians are able to film their reality for themselves. And I think people understand what's going on. And absolutely, the legislation that's being proposed is just a symbol and a reflection of where the consciousness has shifted. And it's just going to keep getting, the pressure is just going to keep building.
I wanted to show our audience clips from your show, because that I think would be a wonderful introduction for them, those of you who have not followed Abby and followed her work. So let's pull that up, and we really wish you the best in what you do, and I hope your message gets to more people who really need to see, especially when we were, my husband is a doctor, and it was for the first time when COVID hit, it wasn't like, there's this cartoon of where they're inducting the doctors into the heroes, that,
Yeah.
And I was just like, yes, it's not just people who are in military fatigues who are heroes. Like, give our nurses, our healthcare workers, janitors on, grocery store workers who are working right through this pandemic. That notion of what a hero looks like needs to change in our books, and a lot of that. I mean, even literature, children's book, how much of this perpetuates the empire. Like, we really need to take, and perhaps would love to see you do a show on that. But
good idea.
Thank you so much. So let's pull that up, Wade.
It's great to see all of you here. My name is Abby Martin, Abbymartin. I'm a journalist, documentary filmmaker, and political commentator. On February 28th, 2020, I was scheduled to speak at Georgia Southern University. I was to be the keynote speaker at the International Critical Media Literacy Conference. I planned my work and life schedule around this event months in advance. As the conference date approached, I was told that I must sign a contract pledging to not participate in boycotts against Israel. Knowing this was a violation of my constitutional right to free speech and right to protest, I informed them that I could not sign such a contract. I was then canceled as the speaker from the conference. As a journalist, I have reported extensively on Palestine, US, and Israeli violations of international law, including many on-the-ground reports on the illegal military occupation and human rights abuses for over 10 years. I recently directed a documentary called Gaza Fights for Freedom. It advocates for the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Through its political, military, and economic support, the US is supporting egregious human rights violations of several UN resolutions, the Geneva Conventions, and more. All of this is not up for debate. The BDS movement exists to mount pressure against Israel to stop these atrocities, similar to the grassroots movement that brought the end of apartheid in South Africa. But advocating for Palestine or criticizing Israel was not the topic of my speech at Georgia Southern. I was scheduled to give a talk as a journalist about media and media literacy. For this, I was being asked to contractually pledge loyalty to a foreign country. How could I comply with this request? Was I supposed to delete and destroy all the copies of my film that I had just released because it advocates BDS? Was I supposed to remove all video reports on my company's websites of all the interviews I have done about my reports on countless news outlets because they advocate BDS? Of course, I should not be expected to do these things, simply to work in the state of Georgia. I want to explain the two reasons I felt compelled to pursue a legal case over this incident. First, my work as a journalist involves speaking about the stories I've covered at universities and public venues. It has been my career for over a decade, and this event at Georgia Southern was just one of many such events I do every year. My right to speak at a conference on media at a public university was conditioned on my pledge to never participate in my constitutional right to engage in peaceful political action. It is not just this particular conference, but my right to speak at any public university or similar event in the entire state has been taken away because I will not forfeit my constitutional rights by signing this pledge. My right to speak about any topic cannot be conditioned on throwing away my constitutional rights, and I shall not be made to submit to never be able to speak at a publicly funded institution in the state of Georgia. That's an absurd expectation. And I know there are countless more people just like me who either lose their right to free speech in the state or submit to forfeiting their constitutional rights. These rights are invaluable, and as an American citizen, and American people should not be willing to give them up. I know that I am not. Second, separate from my professional life, in my personal life, I am politically active against issues of racism and injustice. This is of great moral importance to me. To be made to choose between my career that I have built my entire adult life around and my political convictions, which are of invaluable importance to me, and a right supposed to be protected by the US Constitution is an outrage and is unacceptable to me as an American citizen. I want to reiterate, situations of oppression, racism, injustice, and violations of international law that are funded by my tax dollars is something I care very deeply about. They are ideals that I've centered my entire life around. Like anyone who has deeply held moral or spiritual beliefs, I should not be expected to throw them away in order to simply work in the state of Georgia. Apart from my right to free speech, it was my right to peaceful protest, my right to boycott, and not just mine, but the constitutional rights of every independent contractor of all types who want to work in this state cannot be held with such disregard by the Georgia legal system. My aim here is to overturn these laws
that violated my rights, the rights of likely thousands of contractors, and that violate the US Constitution every single day. Thank you very much.
Well, that's fascinating. Could you tell us some upcoming episodes of Empire Files that we can keep a lookout on?
Absolutely. So that was a press conference that I launched the lawsuit alongside my lawyers with CARE and the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. But typically we do mini documentaries, in-depth interviews, and exposés and monologues about several subjects. So recently we did a whole monologue about the medical apartheid reality in Israel as a reaction to the Saturday Night Live controversy. We also have a series called Reporting from Palestine on our YouTube playlist at Empire Files. That shows everything from the military occupation of the West Bank to the history of colonization of Palestine, to the issue of African refugees in the country, and the refugee camps. It goes on and on, settler terrorism, home demolitions. So that I really encourage people to check out. And then, of course, the Gaza Fights for Freedom documentary, which you can check out at GazaFightsForFreedom.com. It's available in Arabic, Spanish, and English. And that's just an incredible on the ground, carrying the viewer through the Great March in a way that you've never seen before, and also a thorough documentation proving extensive Israeli war crimes against protected categories of the Geneva Conventions: children, medics, journalists, and disabled people. Direct targeting by snipers of maiming and killing those people. As far as what's coming up, we have a huge series about the U.S. military in Africa coming up. And of course, just constantly, covering the news through the lens of U.S. imperialism and militarism. We have an Empire update that we are trying to do bi-monthly, which just kind of gives a roundup of what the U.S. is doing around the world in our name and how it affects Americans here at home. So I encourage everyone to check it out at the empirefiles.tv. Sign up for our mailing list, because you never know when big tech is going to, have the heavy hand of the government shut us down.
Yeah, we're all worried about that. So thank you so much, Abby, for your time here, and for our audience for joining us here. And I'd love to have you back on the show once some of those. I'd love to talk about Empire in Africa. That is definitely something that we're seeing. So thank you all, and assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much for having me.